Greetings from Houston. Thank you for joining me in this presentation where I will present some of the findings in a paper where I studied the influence of foreign sources, particularly Chinese media, on the news coverage of COVID-19 in China in African digital media. So this paper sort of follows some of my previous research on the presence of Chinese media on the African continent, which has been increasing over the last 10 years. There's been a push by Chinese authorities to try to internationalize its media sector with the hope that with the wider presence of its media overseas, it would be able to control the narrative on China and on China-Africa relations, particularly in the context of Africa. Media like CCTV or Xinhua, which is a news agency, have expanded operations in Africa. The case of COVID-19 is a good one because it allows us to compare news coverage across multiple African countries, which is logical because COVID-19 affected pretty much every single country on the continent. But more importantly, COVID-19 was a point at which China really pushed its efforts to try to control the narrative on how the world talk about COVID-19, the outbreak of the pandemic, and then its spread overseas. So with this paper, I am trying to sort of revisit some of the things that we know so far about global media flows and global news flows. We know that there's a very extensive literature that has looked at the influence that news agencies in the global north might be having on agencies in the global south, and how this research has sort of since the 2000s moved towards particularly the TV news content, and it has tried to understand how state-sponsored media, whether it's Qatar's Al Jazeera, Russia's RT, or China's CGTN, might be having an impact on the local news agendas of different countries. Within this context, we still know relatively little about how effective are these strategies, particularly by China and in the context of Africa. We know very little about how much content that is originally produced by China is actually used by African media, given the really significant push that the authorities have been having to try to control narratives on China and Africa relations. So a good theoretical framework to study this is obviously intermedia agenda setting. As we know, that's the ability of established news organizations to either influence the salience of certain issues on less established news organizations, or to have an influence on the way some of these issues are portrayed. This research has been mostly focused on domestic media, but we see in recent years some cases of studying intermediate agenda setting in a global setting, and that's the case of work by Guo and Vargo, who have coined this term of transnational intermediate agenda setting. And I will be looking at one case of intermediate agenda setting in this transnational context, which is this ability that a country might have to transfer the salience of issues associated with itself onto the media of other countries, right? So this is what specifically is I'm trying to understand with this paper, that is the ability that China might have of transferring the salience of certain issues as they relate to China. So that's done through 4 research questions. First, I'm going to look at the overall coverage of COVID-19 in China. Then I'm going to measure the exact amount of text that comes from Chinese sources that is reused by African media. I'm going to compare English and French sources. And finally, I'm going to look at narratives. And I'm going to do all of this using a computational approach. So I collected 500,000 news articles published between January and May last year. And they come from both French-speaking and English-speaking countries. And then those are in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then also media from the US, from the UK, from China, and from France to try to compare the influence of different international news organizations. Data comes from 3 sources: Nexus Uni, a database of news content; News API, which is a commercial service similar to Nexus Uni; and GDLT, a database of news content. For this analysis, I use several computational approaches, and those include text similarity algorithms that give us a score of how similar two texts are, and then structural topic modeling, which is an unsupervised machine learning approach that helps us classify documents into a set number of topics. The analysis for this paper was done using R, and for the first half of the paper, I used pure word frequencies to try to compute similarity between documents. For that, I used an R package called R News Flow, and I consider that two texts are similar to each other when they have a cosine similarity score of 0.97. The second part of the paper uses structural topic modeling, which is, again, an unsupervised machine learning approach that helps us use metadata to classify documents into categories. If anybody is interested, I posted all the scripts and the data for this paper on this GitHub repository that you can visit when you're watching this video. And if you have any questions, obviously you can ask them on the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. So let me address or present the results of the 4 research questions. The first question looked at overall coverage, and what I found specifically is that there was very limited coverage of China generally on African media, right? So if you look at the first column that represents the month of January, you'll see that China was not a particularly widely talked about topic, and there's an increase that goes with COVID becoming more serious. We also see a disparity in how China is talked about, right? So in African media, or most African media, China is rarely a topic of discussion, but that's not the case of Chinese media, obviously. There's almost like 200 stories that Xinhua produces every day about China that then it distributes globally. And we also see that global news agencies like Reuters or France Press publish more than 100 stories about China every day. That compares to like 1.2 average news stories about China that appear in African media before COVID-19, right? So there's this huge disparity in the amount of coverage. So what happens when we look at how much text from global media, whether it's Chinese sources, French sources, or British sources, appears on African media? Well, I found that approximately 4% of the whole corpus is a case of text reuse, that is content that came from foreign sources that is reused word by African media. Here I'm showing you the results of the English corpus, and you'll see that the most text reuse comes from French sources, particularly Agence France Presse, where Kenya and Uganda, for example, use more than 10% of content from France Presse. That is wire that gets used directly on its website. China has a much lower percentage, where the highest country is Sierra Leone with 3%, but most countries have a very small percentage. When it comes to covering China and COVID-19, most African media did not rely on Chinese sources. They relied a lot more on French sources, 65%, British sources, 25%, only 7% of the text that is reused comes from Chinese sources. I also found that if we compare the English corpus with the French corpus, there's a lot less text reuse in the French corpus, where China is still much less used than the other 2 countries. So for the final research question, I tried to look at the narratives, right? So instead of looking at the specific reuse word by word of content, here I look at what are the more prevailing narratives that are on Chinese media and whether there's a mapping with African sources. And I'm showing you the top 5 for China and the top 5 for Gambia and Kenya as 2 examples. 2 things that stand out here. One is that the most prevalent topic in Gambia and Kenya and many other media are topics that do not appear on Chinese media. In this case, there were some incidents of racism against Africans in China, and that was the most often talked about topic by African media, but we do not see it appear on Chinese media. At the same time, we see that the most frequently talked about topics on Chinese media, such as China is in control or Chinese medical equipment being sent worldwide, do not really appear systematically in every other country. While we see them appear in Gambian media, they are absent from Kenyan media. So let me summarize the results here. There's 3 findings here. One, that news coverage of China is relatively limited on African media, that Chinese sources are not the most prevalent foreign sources that we see on African media, and that there's a huge gap between narratives of Chinese sources and non-Chinese sources. So we could say that transnational intermediate agenda setting of Chinese sources is pretty much non-existing. There might be reasons to explain this. One can be that African journalists have certain reluctance to use Chinese content, as some researchers have shown in the past, or maybe that when it comes to COVID-19, this issue was very domestic and that journalists did not think that using Chinese sources was the best approach. Overall, more research probably is needed on this topic, but hopefully you found this paper interesting, and if you want to know more about it, ask questions on the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.